Welcome.
Welcome to the Everything podcast, and in this episode I'm going to be recapping Bad Tidings, which is a Christmas film that was released on the 22nd of December 2024. And if you didn't watch yesterday's episode, I showed you the trailer for Bad Tidings at the end of it, so I would suggest, well, I'd love you to watch all the episodes, but yeah, obviously if you want to see the trailers for the things I'm talking about, I'm going to be recapping, then put those in that's where they are. They're at the end of the last episode, just so it's easier for you to understand. So without further ado, here's my recap for Bad Tidings. The film starts off by playing We Wish You a Merry Christmas. This film starts in March. Neil complains about Scott's Christmas lights still being up. Scott asks his daughter what each tin has in it. Scott says goodbye to Holly. Neil confronts Scott about his Christmas lights. We now jump to August. We then have the title sequence. The film now jumps to December. This film is set in Stockport. Neil spies on Scott. Neil and Chloe insult each other. Neil's wife mentions Graham. Neil retrieves his bin. Neil pretends to be unsuccessful, which is unsuccessful, as that's not right. Pretends to be a postman, which I think, because I've watched the film, so I know what it is, which is unsuccessful, as Scott recognised him straight away. Neil explains himself. Scott believes Neil has become sentimental with his green bin. Neil badmouths Graham. Neil believes Scott is targeting him. Scott reveals Neil's nickname. Scott is planning on nominating himself to be the Neighbourhood Watch's coordinator. Chloe returns home crying, which Neil doesn't notice. Neil's wife informs Neil that Chloe has been mugged. Neil's wife is annoyed at Neil's response to this. Stacy leaves prison. The Brennan siblings argue. Scott jokes about being blind. Neil unexpectedly shows up at the Neighbourhood Watch meeting to decide the new Neighbourhood Watch coordinator. Scott explains why he's nominated himself to be considered for the new Neighbourhood Watch coordinator. All the other nominees drop out until Neil nominates himself to be considered for the new Neighbourhood Watch coordinator. Neil mentions Scott being blind. Neil and Scott are appointed, here's the wait for the mouthful, co-Neighbourhood Watch coordinators. The film now jumps to the 23rd of December. Scott gets on his roof to attempt to take down his Christmas lights at Neil's request. Scott informs his and Neil's neighbours of this. The Sues help Scott get down from his roof. Neil sets up his new Christmas decorations. Laura believes Neil is having a breakdown. Neil accidentally deafens his neighbours. Neil turns on his Christmas lights. Neil's Christmas lights cause a power cut. A man suggests that the neighbours spend Christmas out elsewhere. Scott volunteers to keep an eye on the neighbours' house while they spend Christmas somewhere else. Neil also volunteers to keep an eye on the neighbours' houses. Neil attempts to explain why he needs to stay on the street. Neil's wife believes Neil is obsessed with Scott. The Brennans discuss stealing. Stacy learns about the power cut that Neil caused. Stacy tells Big Barry about this. The Brennans plan on robbing Scott and Neil's street. The neighbours, including Neil's family, leave the street. Neil and Scott make their teas. Neil sets fire to a tea towel. Neil orders a takeaway. Neil gets his pizza and wishes his pizza delivery driver a Merry Christmas. Neil cries whilst watching a film. Neil's laptop dies. Stacy attacks Mr. Baldwin. One of the robbers is scared by something. This robber does a Gollum impression. Photos of Laura convince Neil to offer Scott some of his pizza. Neil backs out of doing this. Scott hears something. Scott calls Neil. Scott's phone runs out of charge. Scott informs Neil about the robbers. Neil believes Scott is wrong. Scott convinces Neil to find out one way or the other. Neil points out the difference between his job and a SWAT team's job. Scott is right, and Neil sees physical proof of this, which he then runs away from. One of the robbers insults another due to Neil and Scott being home. Chloe wraps a present. Laura apologises to Chloe. Scott and Neil have ran the police whilst trying to stay calm. Neil knows who the Brennans are. One of the robbers is able to get into Neil's home as the door was left unlocked. Neil headbutts the banister. Neil and Scott argue about how secure Neil's house is. Chloe messages Neil. The robber replies to Chloe's message and destroys Neil's phone. Neil reveals how long the average police response time is. Scott introduces himself to the robber. Neil attacks the robber. Neil falls down the stairs. Scott and Neil hide in a car. The police arrive. The police interact with some of the robbers. The police leave. Scott and Neil attempt to create a plan on how to survive the night. A car alarm sounds. Neil and Scott kidnap one of the robbers. One of the other robbers misunderstands Stacey's words. Neil unveils his plan. Scott points out why Neil's plan is a cowardly one. Scott creates a newspaper headline on about his and Neil's current situation. Scott angers Neil by mentioning Graham. Neil and Scott threaten one of the robbers. Neil and this robber fight. Scott helps Neil. Laura attempts to comfort Chloe after he explains why she is worried about Neil. The Brennans have tied up Scott and Neil. Stacey reveals that it was one of Neil's cameras that was used to take Stacey to prison. One of the robbers threatened Neil with a screwdriver. Chloe can't sleep and tracks one of her belongings. Neil blames Scott for their current situation. Scott reveals the truth about the complaint of Neil's car. Neil lists how helpful the neighbours are with Scott. Scott mentions his late wife. Scott tells Neil about his daughter and the real reason he moved into the street. Scott comes clean about stealing Neil's bin. Neil and Scott attempt to set themselves free. Scott and Neil successfully achieve this. Scott accidentally sets himself on fire. Neil offers to help put Scott out. Scott and Neil set up a trap for the robbers. Scott and Neil bet on if the kidnapped robber would scream. Neil owes Scott £10. Scott sprays something in one of the robbers' eyes. One of the robbers falls through the floor. Neil attaches musical lights to this robber. Scott forces another of the robbers to headbutt the loft roof. Neil retrieves Chloe's belonging and steals the robber's phone. Neil runs away from Stacey. Scott dares another of the robbers. Scott bats a can at the robber's face. Scott hits the robber in his privates. Stacey mentions Narnia. Scott and Neil lock Stacey in the bathroom. Stacey sets herself free by falling through the floor. Neil and Scott celebrate escaping the house. One of the robbers rolls down the stairs. Neil attempts to start his car while sitting on the kidnapped robber. Scott reverses into some bins. Neil and Scott battle with the kidnapped robber for control of the car. The kidnapped robber screams and Stacey hits a tree. Stacey knocks out Neil. Chloe attacks Stacey. Neil and Chloe reunite. Scott asks the kidnapped robber to be quiet. The Brennans are arrested. Scott, Chloe and Neil are being interviewed. Laura learns of Chloe's involvement with the robbers. Laura and Chloe reunite. Neil apologises. Laura calls Neil an idiot. Neil gives Chloe her Christmas present. Chloe is delighted. Neil invites Scott to join him, Laura and Chloe for pizza. The street have a Christmas party. Neil kisses one of the neighbours. The road have a photo. The power returns and Neil and Laura kiss. That is my recap for Bad Tidings. What next time on the Everything podcast? It is Junior Taskmaster Season 1 Episode 7. Here's the trailer. It'll be the season trailer. So for some, I should mention that for some shows it will be, like for Big Finish it'll be the actual release. For Creature Commandos it'll be the episode. But for something like Junior Taskmaster, it's going to be the season trailer, or in some cases there might not be a trailer at all. So without further ado, here's the trailer for Junior Taskmaster Season 1.
Hi Alex.
Alex? Who's Alex?
Hi mate.
It's me! I'm in charge! I know exactly what the kids want.
Is that what you've been paid to do? That went worse than I thought.
That does not look safe. Oh my god.
Come off, you little bum poo-poo head.
Pause.
Can you take this to our house?
Do not Google how old we are.
Mr. Scorpion. This is why I don't like you.
Yes, we have lost control of the ship.
Brand new Junior Taskmaster on Channel 4 starts Friday at 8.
For more Taskmaster, subscribe now.
That was the trailer for Junior Taskmaster Season 1, and I will be recapping Episode 7 in tomorrow's episode. But let me know in the comments below what you thought of Bad Tidings if you watched it. My view, if you didn't, you can put your thoughts, as I've just said, on both of those in the comments below, as well with anything else from series on the channel, such as any previews or recaps. Put those in the comments below as well. And remember, you can also like, comment and subscribe. And that's it for this episode of the Everything Podcast. Goodbye.